I'd like to speak a little this afternoon about the theme of this retreat, which I chose to call the path of service. I chose this particular topic for a number of reasons, some of which I think will be obvious to you. One is that the path of service plays an absolutely central role in many of the world's great wisdom traditions. As a lot of us are aware, in Buddhism, we talk about the Bodhisattva path, which is the path that integrates our work on ourselves with our service work in the world. In the yogic traditions of Hinduism, we talk about the path of karma yoga, which is conscious action in service to the benefit of others. Christian tradition talks about Christian charity and being an instrument of the divine and doing what we can possibly do to be of service to those who need help the most. Jewish tradition talks about what in Hebrew is called tikkun olam, which is the effort that we make to create wholeness in the world again. It also talks about the practice of the mitzvah, which is an act of generosity and kindness in relation to others, and so forth. Right? So that's one reason I chose this particular topic. Another is that, as I mentioned at the outset of this retreat, I think this particular aspect of spiritual practice and training is of particular importance at this time, given what we've experienced in the last 13 months or so, and what we're facing in the months to come, as we begin to try to understand how to transition to whatever will come next in relation to this pandemic and its aftermath. Interestingly, one of the quotes I came across when I was researching this particular talk was from the founder of the Shingon school of Japanese Buddhism, a teacher named Kukai, who in one of his writings said quite directly, you can measure the depth of a person's awakening by how they serve. When I look at people like His Holiness the Dalai Lama and some of the other people I feel inspired by, I can see the truth of that kind of statement. The other aspect of this that comes into play that I think is quite important is that the path of service is a clear and direct reminder to us that in the process of working on ourselves in service to our own awakening, it's critically important that we don't become exclusively self-involved. Because there's a risk, if we're not careful in spiritual training, that we can essentially create a kind of glorified narcissism in which we deepen our own self-involvement and lose touch with the actual reason that we're working on ourselves. Yeah? The writer George Bernard Shaw captured this potential problem in a quote that I return to over and over again, because I think he nailed it so beautifully. He said, "This is the true joy in life, the being used for a purpose recognized by yourself as a mighty one, the being a force of nature instead of a feverish, selfish little clod of ailments and grievances, complaining that the world will not devote itself to making you happy. I am of the opinion that my life belongs to the whole community, and as long as I live, it is my privilege to do for it whatever I can. I want to be thoroughly used up when I die, for the harder I work, the more I live. I rejoice in life for its own sake. Life is no brief candle to me. It is a sort of splendid torch which I've got hold of for the moment. And I want to make it burn as brightly as possible before handing it on to future generations. Even with the bite that Shaw included in that particular comment, you can feel what he's saying, that it's really important that we fundamentally recognize our interconnectedness, which of course in Buddhism we call dependent origination. I really like Thich Nhat Hanh's term that he calls interbeing, right? Because the desire and the impulse to be of service is rooted directly in the intuitive understanding of our interconnectedness with each other, with the earth, and with all of reality. My primary teacher when I lived in Nepal in the 1980s, Trungpa Rinpoche, used to talk about service in relation to what he called the two wings of the Dharma. He likened the Dharma to a bird that had two wings, and both were necessary in order for the bird to fly. One was the wing of wisdom, which is what, of course, allows us to see and directly experience the interdependent web of reality itself. And the other wing is the wing of compassion, because when we have a felt experience of our interconnectedness with reality and every living being, the natural movement of our heart when we are in the presence of suffering is to extend ourselves and to try to help out in some way. This makes perfect sense, I think, for many of us who have practiced for a while. We can understand it intellectually. And it's the vision behind many service projects. While I was living in Nepal, I spent about 3 years working for a public health eye care program called the Seva Foundation that Ram Dass and some other people had started, some people from the public health school at the University of Michigan. When that organization was founded in 1978, they had an initial gathering, and out of that gathering, they wrote a poem collectively that became a kind of commitment statement for the people involved in the organization. Took place at Walden Woods, a place in Michigan. So they just called it the Walden Woods Statement. This is how it reads. Clear, cold light of winter sun through leafless trees by a frozen lake. People meeting there for a common purpose. People from different places leading different lives. Doctors and bureaucrats, wise men and professional madmen, tree farmers and students who shared only one thing in common, a desire so great as to be a need, the need to serve. A desire so great, a need to do something to relieve human suffering. We are here not to wait for the perfect society, since we are not perfect ourselves. Nor have we the obsessive belief that we can make all beings happy. We have, however, the certitude that much of the world's suffering is unfair and avoidable. And we pledge ourselves to do something about it. By this lake in December, surrounded by oak trees, leafless yet waiting confidently for spring, we pledge ourselves to serve. One of the things I loved about working with that organization was the way in which the attitude conveyed in that reading was a living dimension of working for the organization. the collection of people was fascinating. There were a lot of people from various bureaucratic medical organizations, like the Center for the CDC was part of it. The public health school at the University of Michigan was part of it. And at the same time, one of the board members was Wavy Gravy, who some of you might remember from the 60s, who was the MC at Woodstock in 1969 and was the head of a hippie organization and commune called the Hog Farm, right? Wavy made rules for the board meetings, which took place at a summer camp he had in Northern California that was a circus camp for kids called Camp Win-a-Rainbow. So all of these people, some of whom were bureaucrats quite unaccustomed to summer camps of this kind, would come to Camp Win-a-Rainbow and we'd stay in teepees. And then we'd have these board meetings, right? Wavy made a rule that you weren't allowed to use the word serious in any of the conversations at the board meetings. And if you did, you had to take the punishment, which was determined by Wavy. One year, it was wearing a beanie with a propeller on the top for the rest of the meeting, right? The next year, it was sitting on a whoopee cushion, right? So every now and then, somebody would get all involved in some issue. Like we had projects in Guatemala, we had Native American reservation projects in the United States, we had projects in India and Nepal, all over the place. And at one point, there was a discussion going on about where the money should go. And somebody sort of banged their fist on the desk and said, "We're talking serious money here." And everybody in the room just pointed their finger at this person, and Wavy dished out the punishment, right? My point here partly being that dealing with suffering and being joyful at the same time is allowed. In fact, it's recommended, because if we're going to face the difficulties that create so much of the suffering on this planet, not in a way that avoids their realities, but in a way that gives us energy and inspiration, we need to find some way to connect with our joy in the process of service, essentially. Yeah. What I think a lot of us discover is that even when we appreciate the importance of the path of suffering in our lives, it's not necessarily so easy to see where we feel called to serve. And in fact, how to know when we're actually helping and when in some cases we're not, can itself be somewhat complex. That was a fascinating discovery for me in terms of doing international development work, because it seemed that when I was living in Nepal, for example, much of the Nepali economy was foreign aid, essentially. At the time, it was the fourth poorest country in the world, and the average per capita income for a family was equivalent to $140 a year, right? And I could see that some countries came in and were helpful in a way that disempowered the local people. And other people came in with a very different approach in a way that actually supported and empowered the local people. Yeah. I was thinking about how complex some of these issues can be, and I came across this piece of writing by someone who understood that helping needs to be something we look deeply at and make wise choices about. He writes, "You ask yourself what helping is, or who helps, or what helps, and how much, and when you are and when you aren't. And the whole conversation can get a little bit dizzy. What you're talking about is something you really understand instinctively, but the words can start to have a life of their own. Not that it isn't a wonderful topic, but there's always the potential for it all turning into the tea party at Alice in Wonderland. I get evidence of this in a phone call one day. I'm talking to a woman who is working for the Gallup Poll. she's actually doing a poll on how much time people spend helping. She's trying to explain the criteria. I finally start to crack up, seeing something of the absurdity of it all. You all are crazy, I said. How much time are people helping? What kind of question is that? I said, tell Gallup he's nuts. She started to laugh as well. I know, that's what I said too. What can I tell you? It's a job. She was sort of whispering, which made me laugh even more. We got into this conspiratorial, infectious laughter at it all. When we stopped laughing, I asked her, was that helping? She said, I guess so, sort of. Why was it? I said, that's your job. You tell me why. And then I threw in, we were trying to make the best of a nutty situation. In fact, that's what I'm trying to do all the time. That's it. I want you to put me down in the Gallup poll as someone who helps all the time. More laughter. She said, we don't have a category for all the time. O ye of little faith, I said. But we do have a line here that says all of the above. At this point, I didn't know if she was kidding, but I went for it. Perfect. Put me down under all of the above. I am very all of the above. In fact, you have to put everybody down under all of the above because everybody's trying to make the best of a nutty situation. Gallup can release a poll saying everybody in America is helping. God, she said, I wish I had the nerve. Maybe I'll do it with alternate answers. 1 out of every 2 people in America is helping. The other half is being helped. By this point, we were just in love with the idea of throwing the topic back into blessed confusion, which is where it really is anyhow. Finally, we said goodbye. It's been great, I said. Very helpful, she agreed. Months later, there's a story in the newspaper. Gallup poll reveals half of all Americans help out as volunteers. Right there in the paper, she did it. She pulled it off. I rush into the kitchen, reading the headline to my wife. That's me, I claim. Which half, says my very formidable and wonderful wife. All of the above, I answered triumphantly. Just wash the dishes, she replies. So it's funny on one level, right? Because much of the time when we make choices about how to help and how to use what we can offer, we start into the process with a version of the Braille method. We try to find our way forward and see what our particular circumstance is, what's needed, and how to put the two together in terms of what we can offer, right? But what we find if we're committed spiritual practitioners is that understanding empathy and compassion in a wise way and looking deeply at questions of where can I make my optimal contribution is something that requires our full intellect and heart and attention to understand on a deep level. I first started working in a helping capacity as a 20-year-old when I volunteered at a prison in New Orleans as an undergraduate student. That was over 50 years ago. And I'm still fascinated with this topic of how to understand how to work on myself and be of service in the world in a way that optimizes the benefits I can bring into the world. Ram Dass and Mirabai Bush, in their book Compassion in Action, talk about the challenge that comes into play when we really try to understand compassionate action and the paradoxes that it involves. They write, compassion in action is paradoxical and mysterious. Notice all the paradoxes now. It is absolute, yet continually changing. It accepts that everything is happening exactly as it should, and it works with a full-hearted commitment to change. It sets goals, but knows that the process is all there is. It is joyful in the midst of suffering and hopeful in the face of overwhelming odds. It is simple in a world of complexity and confusion. It is done for others, but it nurtures the self. It shields in order to be strong. It intends to eliminate suffering, knowing that suffering is limitless. It is action arising from emptiness. And then they go on to say, when we look at the vast sadness and suffering in the world, we often experience intense pain in our hearts. The suffering so often seems cruel, unnecessary, and unjustified, reflecting a heartless universe. The human greed and fear that are causing much of the suffering often seem out of control. But when our hearts open in the midst of this, we want to help. This is the experience of compassion. So what's needed, as I understand it, is for those of us who are committed to the process of awakening to be willing to choose to become what I call wounded healers. People who work on ourselves with the understanding that our work on ourselves is simultaneously a service to our own happiness and well-being, and a way in which we can learn to become more effective instruments of suffering in the world. We talked a bit earlier at this retreat about the way in which suffering from a spiritual perspective is understood to be something that's functional. As I said earlier, it's clearly not desirable. We wouldn't wish it on ourselves or anyone else, and yet it inevitably touches our lives. When it does, the question that comes up is, how are we going to work with it? And can we do so in such a way as to turn poison into medicine, as the Tibetans would say, by having our experience on the personal level of suffering increase our capacity to be effective in relating to the suffering of others. Here's a story about a chemotherapy nurse, a man who worked in a children's cancer ward. And you can see how the work that he did on himself was incorporated into his service to the children. I have a friend, the writer wrote, a chemotherapy nurse in a children's cancer ward, whose job it is to pry for any available vein in an often emaciated arm, to give infusions of chemicals that sometimes last as long as 12 hours, and which are often quite discomforting for the child. He is probably the greatest pain giver the children meet in their stay in the hospital. Because he has worked so much with his own pain, his heart is very open. He works with his responsibilities in the hospital as a, quote, laying on of hands with love and acceptance, unquote. There is little in him that causes him to withdraw, that reinforces the painfulness of the experience of the children. He is a warm, open space which encourages them to trust whatever they feel. And it is he whom the children most often ask for at the time they are dying. Although he is the main pain giver, he is also the main love giver. This is a hard one for a lot of us. It's really tempting in many cases to experience our own suffering with a sense of confusion, or perhaps self-pity or self-judgment or something of that sort. Once we take the first noble truth into our heart and understand that suffering is inevitably a part of every human life, oftentimes in ways that we can't intellectually understand, there's a way in which we learn to surrender to it when it does touch our lives and allow it to become what Ram Dass called grist for the mill of awakening. Yes, we are changed by it. And the question is, will we be changed in a way that contracts us and removes us from life, or in a way that allows our broken hearts to become bigger so we can deepen our engagement with life? The writer Annie Lamott, who has a great gift for being simultaneously hilariously funny and profoundly deep, talked about her experience of grief in this way. You will lose someone you can't live without, and your heart will be badly broken. And the bad news is that you never completely get over the loss of your beloved. But this is also the good news. They live forever in your broken heart that doesn't seal back up. And you come through. It's like having a broken leg that never heals perfectly, that still hurts when the weather gets cold, but you learn to dance with a limp. I've seen this in my own life on a number of occasions, one of which I've talked about occasionally in Dharma talks, but always comes to mind when I think about the way my own struggles and befriending my own shadow material has enabled me to show up more effectively for others. I first trained in psychology in the late 60s and early 70s. And then after graduate school in the mid 70s, began to work in private practice. And after several years of working in private practice and having meditated and trained as a yoga teacher and such at the time, I felt pretty confident about most of the issues that people brought into my office. And for the most part, I felt like I was accepting of the problems people brought and non-judgmental in a way that allowed people who worked with me to be safe. Yeah. There was one population, however, that I could not stop feeling judgmental about. And these were sometimes court referrals in domestic violence cases in which people had abused children. And as much as I wanted to be open-hearted and non-judgmental, there was some part of me that simply could not get past feeling judgment about someone who had burned a young infant or a toddler with cigarettes as a punishment, for example, or physically injured a child, and so forth. Right? Intellectually, I understood that that person probably came from a lineage of abuse and themselves had probably been abused. But there was something about sitting in my office with a person who had done that that I just found really, really painful and difficult. Yeah. At the time, I was in and out of relationships, but I wasn't married and I didn't have any children. Yeah. Fast forward the clock some years later, I've become a parent. Yeah. I have an infant daughter who I'm totally in love with. aside from the fact that she seems to have some objection to sleeping much of the time, right? Wasn't something I was accustomed to, and I found it really difficult. I tend to run on pretty high anxiety on a regular basis. So the day she was born, I started worrying about paying for college quite a bit. Right? My wife and I used to take turns getting up at night when our daughter wasn't sleeping. And there was one particular night where I had a big presentation the next day. I had a bunch of clients to see. I felt pretty stressed in terms of my workload at the time, which was overly ambitious if I look back on it. And it was my turn to get up with our daughter, who was howling in a way that was not easy to listen to, right? So I was walking back and forth with her on my shoulder in our living room. And as was my habit at the time, I was quietly chanting Sanskrit mantras to her and singing various kinds of Hindu and Buddhist songs to try to help calm her down. And nothing seemed to work that particular night. Yeah. So there was one point at which I stopped and I was holding my daughter, and I was so confused because I was extremely frustrated and angry. And at the same time, I felt this tremendous love and care. And as I was standing in the living room of our house, which is right by a large front plate glass window, in slow motion, I had this horrific fantasy of, and this was like Kodak clear imagery, of taking my little infant daughter like a football and throwing her through this plate glass window in the front of our house in slow motion, watching the glass break and seeing my daughter in this little blanket I was holding her in roll out onto the front lawn of the house. Yeah. Now, my good fortune was that I was somebody who was lucky enough to have had some good therapeutic work and meditative training that allowed me to have impulse control so that I didn't act on that impulse. But even seeing it as clearly as I did in slow motion enabled me to understand in an entirely new way what was going on for the people who were coming into my office who had hurt children. My impulse was no different than many of theirs. I just had the good fortune to have training and positive circumstances that allowed me to have a skill set for working with intense emotions of that kind. Yeah. And it was intriguing to me to see that the next time someone in that situation came into my office, I could drop into my heart and understand what their pain was about in a way I never could have understood before. Right? This is what I mean when I say that there's a relationship between our work on ourselves and our ability to show up for others. Right? It's one and the same process, like sides of a coin. Yeah. Pema Chodron gives an example in one of her books that captures the same quality of understanding on the deep level of our inner experience what goes on for others. This is Pema. A young woman wrote to me about finding herself in a small town in the Middle East, surrounded by people jeering, yelling, and threatening to throw stones at her and her friends simply because they were Americans. Of course, she was terrified, and what happened to her is interesting. Suddenly, she identified with every person throughout history who had ever been scorned and hated. She understood what it was like to be despised for any reason: ethnic group, racial background, sexual preference, gender. Something cracked wide open, and she stood in the shoes of millions of oppressed people and saw with a new perspective. She even understood her shared humanity with those who hated her. This sense of deep connection, of belonging to the same human family, is bodhicitta, sometimes translated as altruistic intention, or as the Dalai Lama likes to call it, the good heart that we all share. Yeah. So a question that naturally arises once we understand the centrality of the path of service in regard to spiritual awakening is the question, how do we develop an understanding of our unique way to contribute? The idea here is not that we have to do something on a grand scale or move to a poor country on another part of the world. As Mother Teresa liked to put it, quote, ours is not to do great things. It's to do small things with great love. Because each of our circumstances is unique, we all have different strengths and weaknesses. We all have different resources. We all have different stages of life that we're experiencing. Each of us who wants to be stepping onto the path of service has to do so for themselves and to understand that each journey will be unique while at the same time having a universal element to it. There's a quote that's often attributed to the Buddha that I suspect was translated into more current language than that which the Buddha would have used. But I like the sentiment of it. It's a comment that I've heard often from various teachers in which they say, your work is to discover your work. And then with all of your heart, to give yourself to it. I'm not in any way suggesting this is easy. Sometimes it comes naturally and we find our way into a particular form of work or service that feels natural and allows us to experience joy and satisfaction while at the same time being of service to others. Right? That seems to be the intersection we want to aim for when we're trying to intuit how to serve at a given point in time. Years ago in the mid-'80s, when I was training at the Graduate Theological Union out in Berkeley, I had a very close friend who became a Unitarian minister and was the head of a church in Santa Rosa, California for many years, while at the same time his own practice was in the Zen tradition with a teacher named John Tarrant. My friend Dan wrote an article about this process of how we listen for the way in which we're called to be of service. He writes, our calling thus has two facets to it, a deeply personal aspect and a deeply communal aspect. The whole asks of us nothing more than to be truly ourselves, not just laborers for money or seekers of success and prestige, but practitioners of our passion. The understanding is that when we connect most deeply with this personal level, we connect also with the communal level. To find our calling is to find the intersection between our own deep gladness and the world's deep hunger. That point which allows for our fullest expression, even as it provides an avenue for our greatest service. That's the direction we want to move, and that's what we want our aspiration to be in relation to the path of service. This can be extremely challenging at times. It can be fine-tuned over many years, as it sometimes is for various people. And it operates more on the level of intuition than it does exclusively the intellect, right? It's as if we have to listen to our deepest heart what the spiritual teacher Andrew Harvey described beautifully when he was asked how we know where to serve. He said, follow your heartache, which was an interesting phrase to me because for years I had heard and worked with the phrase, follow your heart, in relation to trying to understand how to serve. But adding the word ache really helped because most of us, for various reasons, have a resonance with certain kinds of problems in the world. I spoke earlier at this retreat about the fact that losing my father at a young age, and actually many other people in my life, played a major role in my decision to work in the hospice movement for a number of years. It wasn't an accident that I had a particular resonance with that kind of suffering. When I met my wife, Marcia, many years ago in Nepal in 1987, she was working as a physical therapist with disabled children's programs for Save the Children and a few similar organizations, also for the United Nations. It was only after I got to know her that I found out that when she was quite young, she had been diagnosed with polio, and she had to have a brace on her leg and was not allowed to participate in certain activities when she first went to school. That was completely a shock to me because when I met her, she was sleeping on glaciers at 17,000 feet in Nepal and leading treks all over the country for a place called Wilderness Travel. So I would never have thought of her as someone who had any kind of physical disability. But she remembered what it felt like, and that somehow she had an inclination to reach out and to help children of that sort. Yeah. One of the books that I mentioned earlier that I quoted that Ram Dass quote about compassion from, called Compassion in Action, had a good example of the kind of exercise that can sometimes help us feed into the intuition about where we want to make our contribution. Let's see where I put it. Here it is. This is Mirabai Bush and Ram Dass talking about a friend of theirs. One friend who had been haunted by thoughts of people living in welfare hotels and on the streets did a writing exercise using the phrase, "The way I'd really love to help is." So the assignment that she was given was to work with that phrase on a repetitive basis and just write the answer to it repeatedly on a piece of paper. The way I'd really love to help is, right? And then keep it going. Listen to what happened to her in the process. The way I'd really love to help is to work with homeless mothers, because I know if I were homeless, I would be scared and tired. But I don't know how I could be helpful. What I'd really love to do is use my camera to take pictures. But what good would that do? What I'd really love to do to help is to be together as people, not relating to houses, but to each other as mothers. What I'd really love to do is have fun together, because I know that when you are stressed, it's hard to have fun. But that doesn't sound right somehow either. These rambling thoughts became a small project in which, after talking to homeless mothers about what they would want, she taught them to photograph their own children. The photographs became a gallery show which raised public awareness about the issue of homelessness. To go with the photographs of the children, she created portraits of their mothers. The show was eloquent. People saw the beauty, the humanity, the joy, and the sadness of these families without homes. The young women not only gained treasured photographs of their children, but developed the sense of mastery that comes from learning a new skill, in this case, photography. And our friend was able to do what she really wanted to do. Yeah. Now, that's just one example of how this intuitive process works. So my intent here is not for any of us to feel self-critical or heavy-handed about the ways in which we are or are not being of service at this time. Rather, it's to plant a seed, hopefully, of inspiration in regard to what's possible and the quiet joy and sense of well-being that arises naturally when we're being of service to others in even the smallest ways imaginable. Yeah. The last aspect of this issue that I want to talk about has to do with an embedded question that is central to Buddhist training and in many ways central to all of the perennial philosophy. That is, once we start onto the path of service, there's inevitably a point at which we start to try to understand who it is that's being of service. Said another way, the embedded question here is, who am I? Who are you? Who are we on the deepest and most profound level? Yeah. We all understand what it says on our Social Security card and our driver's license. We all have a body and a personality. And that's who we are on what could be called the relative level of reality, what Tibetans call the conventional level. But as some of us are aware, Buddhist teachings talk about what are called the two truths, the relative level and the absolute level, what Tibetans call the ultimate level. And we come to understand at some point in our practice that each and every one of us, whether we're aware of it or not, according to the teachings, lives on these two levels simultaneously. We want to fully embrace and appreciate and honor the sacredness of our bodies and our personalities, which live in chronological time and have a discernible beginning, middle, and end. That's a beautiful part of who we are, and it's the vulnerability of our humanness that allows us to experience the interbeing that I referred to earlier. At the same time, what's also true is that if we're willing to fully turn toward our humanness and its attendant vulnerability, we also come to discover that part of our humanness is an innate capacity for self-transcendence. That is to say, that in addition to our relative nature, we also have an absolute nature, which in Buddhist tradition we call Buddha nature. In contemplative Christianity, we might call that Christ consciousness. In Zen tradition, as Suzuki Roshi called it, it could be called big mind. Yeah. Some traditions in transpersonal psychology, for example, we often talked about it as the true self with a capital S relative to the small self. Yeah. But ultimately, the process of awakening, as I understand it, is about learning to live on these two levels of consciousness simultaneously, such that the larger dimension of the absolute informs and enlivens the way we live on the relative level. Yeah. As one poet put it that I was looking at earlier, we are the way that light enters the universe. When St. Francis said, "Lord, make me an instrument of thy will," you can feel the two levels that he was talking about. On the relative level, he acknowledged his humanness, and he was reaching out to his divine, to his God, asking to be an instrument of something larger than his small self. when that becomes our experience, there's a certain type of quiet joy associated with becoming an instrument of something much vaster and larger and more mysterious than who we are as a small individual personality. Not that one is better than the other, because both dimensions of who and what we are, in my understanding, are inherently sacred and part of what my friend and teacher, Father Thomas Keating, called the ultimate mystery. At the same time, we do have this amazing and beautiful possibility of becoming living instruments of that ultimate mystery. And that's part of our birthright as human beings, in my understanding. Yeah. This is something that I think deep in many of our hearts we wish for, because we recognize that there's a certain kind of suffering that comes into play when we spend too much time in self-involvement. So one of the real challenges on the path of service involves coming to a wise understanding of self-compassion and self-care, which is a necessary and important part of our lives, and learning to distinguish self-compassion and self-care from self-absorption and self-indulgence, because those are of a different degree, essentially. Yeah. Of course, it's the self-compassion that plants the seeds of our compassion for others. So we don't want to turn against ourselves by any means. Rather, we want to honor and appreciate ourselves in such a way that we can extend that same kind of generosity of spirit to those we come into contact with. So what is it I'm trying to say here? Let me see if I could summarize it, since we're coming to the end of our time for this talk. I started out by suggesting that what I'm calling the path of service plays a central role in many of the world's great wisdom traditions and is inevitably a part of the vast and array of teachings associated with what Aldous Huxley called the perennial philosophy. And I pointed to a number of different formal religious traditions that have a designated role for service, whether we call that the bodhisattva or whether we call that the person who practices as a karma yogi. Yes. Then I talked about the fact that the entire Dharma can be understood in regard to two complementary elements, the two wings of the Dharma I mentioned: wisdom on the one hand and compassion, which are both necessary, because if we only have the wisdom and we understand the way things work, but our hearts are closed, it's easy for us to become aloof. I remember Ram Dass giving an example years ago of someone who was really gifted on the level of wisdom, but really hadn't opened their heart. And he said, that's the kind of person who would walk down the street, and as the person in front of them was falling because they tripped, instead of reaching out, they would mutter under their breath, karma, and just keep walking. Yeah. What we need to do is we need to open our hearts in such a way that balances the wisdom, right? And each of us has different work to do in terms of deepening our wisdom and seeing reality more clearly, and opening our heart and being willing to be vulnerable in the way that's necessary to be what I call the wounded healer, my preferred term for the path of the bodhisattva. So we then acknowledge the complexity of the path of service, that it has a lot of paradox and contradiction built into it, and that it's an ongoing learning process in which we deepen our understanding and we learn from our mistakes. We don't expect ourselves in a perfectionistic way to be 100% skillful in every situation. We then looked at the role of suffering and the fact that it can be understood as a gateway to compassion. Not such that understanding that diminishes our own suffering. Suffering is difficult when we experience it and probably always will be. However, at least when it's imbued with meaning, there's a sense of purpose associated with it, and it can end up helping us to become more effective in our own service work with others, right? And from there, we moved on to look at the process of identifying in what way we feel called to serve. At which point I suggested that that is primarily an intuitive process that draws on both the intellect and the emotions and invites us to take a look at our particular situation, assessing ourselves for what our strengths and weaknesses are, what our stage of life is, what our perhaps professional credentials or roles are, and how we can best contribute in our own unique way. Yeah. And then lastly, I suggested that the embedded question on the path of service that we will return to periodically on a regular basis for as long as we're on the path is, who is it that is on the path of service? How do we understand who we are as we live our lives and move through the world? That is, I suggested we can understand ourselves to embrace what Buddhist teachings call the two truths, that who and what we are exists simultaneously on what I called the relative level of our humanity, with our personalities and our bodies and our vulnerabilities. And through that humanity, we can discover our true nature, as we call it in Buddhism, our Buddha nature, that which actually is beyond word and name and form, yet informs everything we do on the relative level. Yeah. So I'll close with the words of Albert Einstein, who I think captured what I just spoke about in terms of who and what we are in a way that only he could. A human being is a part of the whole called by us universe, a part limited in time and space. We experience ourselves, our thoughts and feelings, as something separated from the rest, a kind of optical delusion of our consciousness. This delusion is a kind of prison for us, restricting us to our personal desires and to affection for a few persons nearest to us. Our task must be to free ourselves from this prison by widening our circle of compassion to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature in its beauty. I want to thank all of you for your kind attention. It's now 4:30 Central Time. We have a half hour in this schedule.